So in 2022, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary announced that the word gaslighting was their word of the year. So that's what I want to talk about today. And as I'll discuss, gaslighting does enormous harm in the most intimate relationships in families and marriages, but also in the political and social worlds, the world of the so-called post-truth politics. So I'm going to start with that. Recently I was trying to engage a MAGA Republican friend of mine in a real conversation, and it was stimulated by various assertions that she was making on social media that seemed to me kind of divorced from reality. But I really wanted to understand how and why she thought these things. But the problem I had to confront right away was that in order to have a real back and forth, a real exchange of ideas or even argument, we'd have to agree on what constitutes evidence. Maybe some of you have had this problem as well. I said to her, look, if I cited something that I'd heard from Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, you'd understandably, I think, be suspicious and dismiss it as liberal propaganda. And, if you cited something you'd heard from Tucker Carlson, I'd very likely react in the same way. So somehow I said we'd have to agree on how to determine truth, what objective truth actually meant, and which sources of it we trust, because without that starting place, the conversation would quickly go off the rails and descend into mutual assured destruction. And so this gets to the issue I want to talk about, which is you can't discuss these issues around truth without introducing the notion of gaslighting and how truth gets distorted and manipulated and damaged often beyond recognition. So, as most of you know, probably, gaslighting is a word that comes from a play and later movie of the same name, in which a husband diabolically and intentionally seeks to drive his wife crazy in order to get his hands on her wealth. And the husband does this in lots of ways. He isolates her and tries to get her to doubt her own perceptions. And the meaning specifically of gaslighting refers to the fact that when the wife notices that the gas lights in the house seem to go up and down, her perceptions are denied, and she's told, in effect, that she's crazy. He tries to drive her crazy, in other words, in small ways and large ways, and is only stopped when an outsider comes in and is able to validate his wife's perceptions. Now, this concept of gaslighting was appropriated by psychoanalysts, and originally it was the work of two teachers of mine from San Francisco, Ed Weinshell and Victor Califf, who were describing a particularly toxic form of child abuse in which a child is given two diametrically opposed messages. On the one hand, the parent communicates something very hurtful to the child, but on the other hand, conveys to the child the message that the parent really only loves the kid, and thus the child's experience of being hurt is fictitious. So the child's actual real experience is minimized or just discounted, like, oh, we love you, or that never really happened that way. You're just imagining it. Or, say a father tells his son something like, you'll never amount to anything. But when the son becomes sullen or depressed in response in any way, the father says, "Oh, I love you. I only want the best for you. You know I was only joking." Or here's a recent example that came up in my own clinical practice. A patient of mine who was regularly punched by her father at the dinner table when she was growing up recently talked to her brother, who was present for all of these beatings, and mentioned that their father, now deceased, had beaten her. And the brother at first denied any memory of these events and then responded with some version of, "Well, you were kind of hard to get along with." Understand the damage done here. You have to realize and remember that the child is dependent on her family and parents in particular for pretty much everything, including what makes up reality, what's right and wrong, what's she supposed to do and feel, what's moral. In other words, the way things are, reality, and the way they're supposed to be are all developed in the context of a family life in which the child's completely dependent on the parents for attachment and for safety, for pretty much everything. So if a child is hurt or abused in some way, and that hurt is denied or discounted by the parents, the child simply can't objectively evaluate reality, and instead will almost always blame him or herself. And when this happens systematically, a child's very ability to test reality is damaged, and in extreme cases creates a psychosis of some kind. We see this toxic interaction very often in the defensive strategies used by spouses who are cheating on their partner. So a woman I treated caught her husband having an affair and also discovered all the ways he was lying about it. And she confronted him about the affair and the lies, to which the husband responded, I'm not lying. You're just imagining things. You're just being paranoid." So, instead of engaging with his wife's accusation, the husband just denied having the affair and accused the wife of making shit up. This dynamic is seen frequently in marriages that are marked with infidelity. The unfaithful spouse has to preserve and protect him or herself and his or her dishonesty, and represent himself or herself as completely innocent, and that any insinuation to the contrary is just crazy. And so in this context, you often run into defensive comments by the gaslighter, like, "Oh, you're just overreacting," or "You're just being unreasonable," or, "You're just being over emotional. You're just being irrational." So, and I say him or her, but really there's somewhat of a highly gendered dimension to this, because the cheater or gaslighter is more often the man than the woman, although it can absolutely and is regularly both. But I think that we see it more when the man is the gaslighter, because the woman is more often in our culture and society dependent on the man. And so these childhood relationships of authority and dependence are repeated over and over again. And so this brings us back to the example I gave of trying to establish ground rules for a conversation with my conservative friend. Because, see, in our society, think about it, we depend on the authority of certain institutions to communicate or convey what's real and what's not. Especially if you think about it, we look to science, don't we? Or to certain organs of government, or certain religious institutions or authorities, or the courts, or unfortunately in modern times, even some influencers on social media. But once these institutions are untrustworthy, are seen as untrustworthy, then everything's up for grabs. I mean, in this situation like that, we've entered into the twilight zone, really, of alternative facts, crazy phrase, or post-truth politics, equally crazy. So we cut off increasingly from sources of truth that might be trustworthy, and our ability to think critically then declines, doesn't it? And as we become more vulnerable and dependent, and this is a type of gaslighting. This is saying that, well, reality is what you're told it is, but that there's a secret, darker reality that's twisting your perceptions and beliefs. Now, a lot of dimensions to this in public life. One is the appearance in public life of denials of plain facts. So we see repeated denials on the MAGA right, for example, of the existence of climate change, even though we're faced every day in the real world with one after another tragic examples of climate change. See, for the right wing, the right, scientific truth is seen and then dismissed as a dangerous fiction, or as irrelevant, or as merely serving the interests of liberals and elites. Or, remember when Trump and others in his wing of the party, Republican Party, denied that Barack Obama was a citizen, the so-called birther conspiracy theory, even though Obama released his actual birth certificate. And when Trump finally had to admit that Obama was a citizen, he did a sidestep and said some version of Hillary Clinton and her campaign started the birther controversy. So when we talk about reality or facts being disputed, I think we see this on the MAGA right all the time. So, there were over 60 court cases adjudicating claims that Trump and his allies made that the 2020 election was fraudulent or stolen. And in every case, their claims were discounted, dismissed, and refuted. The courts, the justice system, is one of those institutions that we can sort of rely on often as authorities to adjudicate truth claims. But in this case, this authority was utterly discounted by Trump and his cronies, or just ignored. Many of you will remember the canard from the right that there was a child kidnapping and abuse network that was run out of a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. Again, a claim so absurd and objectively false, but one that was intended to create an atmosphere of doubt and distrust of the so-called deep state. The net effect of this was intended to deliberately and consciously aid the right in acquiring political power. Now, another tactic of the MAGA right, or the extreme right, is to attack the messenger, to attack and vilify the bearer of news, the bearer of truth claims that the person in power wants to discredit. And this happens all the time, not just in Trump world. Some of you might remember when a Ukrainian passenger jet was shot down in 2020, an attack clearly proven to be from Iran using missiles supplied by Russia. The disinformation campaign that was that put out by Russian and Iranian authorities was just crazy. It's just blaming the Ukrainians, NATO, the U.S. CIA, and any and all actors that these two nations wanted to undermine. And when Brazil's rainforests, Amazon rainforests, were up in flames, President Bolsonaro couldn't be bothered to talk about the fires and their link with climate change, but instead he fired the head of the agency tasked with tracking deforestation. So I think you can see that there's this highly intimate interactions, the highly intimate interactions between parent and child, in which reality is distorted and the child is psychologically coerced into adopting this very corrupt and distorted story, then appears as a dynamic in other settings, in marriages, and in particular in the current social and political climate.